Hey, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Welcome to our second webinar in our sustainability webinar series. I'm sure individuals will continue to join us, but we'll get started for the sake of time. This webinar series is delivered by directors from Veterinary Sustainability Alliance and has been graciously supported both financially and logistically through collaboration with the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association and the Canadian Animal Health Surveillance System, all of which these organizations have goals in promoting sustainable veterinary practice. So it's a really exciting collaboration to be part of. My name is Katie Clow. I sit on the National Issues Committee as well as the Environmental Subcommittee of the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association. And I'm here to introduce this webinar series and actually deliver the webinar along with my partner in crime, Diccon Westworth. So before we get started, I just want to give a reminder, if you maybe haven't seen it already, the CVMA Sustainable Veterinary Practice Initiative has an outreach survey that's open currently. It would have been distributed over email to all members and non-members. It's a quick survey that the CVMA is doing to gauge interests, motivations, barriers for sustainable veterinary practice. So if you do have, 10 minutes to complete this survey, we'd be really grateful. If you can't find it in your email, certainly reach out to the CVMA, and it will likely be shared again just as a reminder. But if you can submit it, it'll give us some helpful data in determining our next steps. So to get started today, this webinar series is one of 4 webinars. So a few weeks ago, Dr. Colleen Duncan and Dr. Will Sander delivered a presentation on sort of why we need to care about sustainability in veterinary practice, sort of the what climate crisis and how climate crisis is impacting animal health, and then where veterinary medicine and the delivery of veterinary medicine comes in. During that time, Dr. Duncan also shared sort of a pathway to sustainable clinic that has been developed by Veterinary Sustainability Alliance. And over the next 3 webinars, we're going to go over the sort of foundational pillars or blocks to put in place to move towards a more sustainable veterinary clinic. So delivering the presentation today, like I said, my name is Katie Clow. I'm a director of Veterinary Sustainability Alliance, and I'm also joined by another director, Diccon Westworth. We both have sort of day jobs in which we also do sustainability, and then we're very passionate about sustainability and have joined the Veterinary Sustainability Alliance to really advance that and enable the sustainable veterinary practice in Canada and the United States. So like I said, if you recall from webinar 1, Dr. Duncan had introduced this co-branded piece that was put out from VSA, AVMA, and CVMA on pathways to a more sustainable veterinary clinic. And this it's meant to be sort of a pathway spiraling out from where you start to where you can continue to go. Some people think it looks like a snail. Regardless of what it looks like, we sort of start at core on and then spiral out as you continue on your sustainability journey. So in this webinar, which is the first of the 3 covering our pathways, we're going to look at core, which is about building an empowered team with clear goals and a path to success. So in other words, today is really about building your foundation and setting yourself up for success. If you've thought about any other initiative that you've been a part of in the sustainability space or not, taking the time to really figure out where you are and where you want to go is critical to making sure any further efforts are going to align with where you want to go. And even if we want to jump in right away, taking that time to build that foundation is really important to set us up for success. So looking at core, there are four main pillars of this setting up to success phase. And we're going to go over each one in detail and give you some tools in your toolkit so that you can take this into your own practice. So our first is convene, which is about starting your clinic sustainability team. The second is assess, which is about looking at your clinic's ecological footprint. The third is about reflection, so reviewing that information and then setting goals. And planning is really about making that implementation plan, figuring out milestones and deliverables. So as we jump in today, we're going to start off with convene. And like I said, this is about starting your clinic sustainability team. And it's important here to be inclusive and support each other, just like in any other team setting. So where do we really begin when we're talking about building a clinic sustainability team? Well, with many initiatives, it's really about starting the conversation. And it's important in this context to involve colleagues across your practice. So the more you can chat with others across different roles, you will get a diversity of opinions and perspectives that can help you see where sustainability might fit into your practice. In having these conversations, you may find individuals that are already passionate and have been thinking about this along the way. And so those are sort of easy wins in building your team. And in other cases, you might have to explain some of that foundational science about why sustainability is relevant in veterinary practice. So again, if you recall from our first webinar, there was kind of two main components. First, that the climate crisis is having widespread and negative impacts in many areas of animal health. And the other being, we're veterinary practitioners, we're seeking to improve animal health, but the way we're delivering veterinary care and our veterinary systems are actually contributing to that climate crisis. So these two things are sort of at odds with each other. I found that having that simple explanation can be very helpful in conversations and seems to resonate really strongly with individuals in the veterinary field, even if it wasn't immediately obvious to them. I have found that, sustainability doesn't always come naturally to those in the veterinary space, but when it's explained in a really accessible way, a lot of people are like, oh, well, yeah, we should really do something about this. And so you might have to take time to highlight some of those aspects of concern. And another way to sort of build your team is connect over shared goals and co-benefits. So individuals have different priorities that they're striving for in veterinary medicine. Some members of the team may be really passionate about staff retention and building a really strong clinic environment. Others may be really passionate about veterinary team health and well-being. Others have finances as a top priority. And as we have already explained and we'll go over again, sustainability has many co-benefits. And so you can highlight some of these as you're moving forward and having those conversations to bring additional members on board, because there are a lot of co-benefits. And those co-benefits may resonate more strongly with other individuals depending on what their priorities are. So once you've had these conversations, now it's time to form your green team. And really, you can call it whatever you want. Some people find green team goofy. We have a green team. I like the name, but you can choose whatever you like. And again, we talk about the importance of being inclusive. So when you're forming your team, the greater the diversity you can have across the clinic, the more perspectives you're going to get, the more creative solutions you're going to have, and ultimately, you're going to have more practical considerations that are going to help in the long term when you're thinking about implementation and being sustainable in your sustainability actions. You also want to solicit support from management. So although some things you can likely do with very little management support, especially to get started, over time, there's going to be a strong need to have management buy-in. So the earlier you can get this buy-in, the better. But if you are met with resistance or maybe a lack of interest, we all know that there are many priorities within veterinary medicine and many competing demands. It might not be something that is immediately obvious or a priority for management. But as you sort of demonstrate your early wins and can sell the importance of this, this may be easier to get over time. And then finally, as you form your green team, there's a few key things that are relevant across any kind of team building. So first, getting to know your team. This is important because you're going to be able to understand why people are there and why they want to contribute and align your activities accordingly so that you're really building that team and allowing people to contribute in the ways that they feel they can and that they can see that they're making a positive difference. And all of that is important for generating energy and retention. So questions like, what has really motivated you to join the green team? What strengths might you bring? And this may be something outside of work. And what are you most concerned about? And I think every individual has some shared things in the sustainability space that bring them there, and some other things that are quite personal to them that they're concerned about and can be strong motivators for action. And then the final part is to take some time, even if it's the more boring time, to outline your group-related processes. When and where are you going to meet? How will you communicate? Because we all know the importance of communication. How will you make decisions? And what is each person's role and responsibility? So now we're going to take a little bit of time to share our experiences building our green teams. So both Diccon and I have built green teams at our workplaces. We both work in quite different contexts, but the same best practices have really applied and are associated with good team building. So I'm going to hand it over to Diccon to share his story, and then I'll share mine.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So at my practice in hospital, the very first step for our transition to practicing veterinary medicine was to create that sustainability team or green team. And I started it by giving a presentation on the effects of climate change, the impacts of practicing medicine, and we concluded with a multitude of environmental impact reduction actions that we could consider implementing. And as Katie alluded to, it's really important that you have a baseline of knowledge so you can onboard people. And so when we had seen all those potential reduction actions that we could consider implementing, we realized that there was going to be a lot of work. So, and when we're going to be trying to prioritize them as well. So we're going to need substantial support and collaboration. And so we formed this group of dedicated, hardworking, like-minded individuals to work together. And it really formed from those that bothered to turn up to that initial presentation. And slowly over time, we've onboarded others. And, it's really important to state that we felt that the role of the team was to really help facilitate the transition with practical, measurable, implementable actions. And we also felt that it was very important, just as Katie was mentioning, that the team should be multidisciplinary. So all sectors of the practice can be afforded the opportunity if they wish to be representative and involved. So we have a veterinarian, that's me. We have multiple custodians and technicians. We have some front desk people, we call client service representatives or CSRs, and also management. So our manager is actually one of our most interactive and engaged members of our team. She's really great. And so this thing can enhance that collaboration and coordination of resources and ideas. And that's been really, really important in rolling out these actions. And it also can encourage implementation by general staff, because an action often feels much more like a good suggestion from a peer rather than a chore or demand by a superior. And then just to point out that this is my sustainability team, or our sustainability team at my hospital. And I'm really proud of them. This is a picture of us in our lobby. We created this beautiful poster of a California redwood grove, and it celebrates our transition to 100% local, renewable ultra low carbon electricity when we partnered with our local utility. And so anyone coming into the practice can see this and can see our commitment to sustainability. And with that, I'll hand back over to Katie. Thanks.
Thanks, Diccon. And similarly, so I work at a large academic institution, and our green team really started off with a similar presentation about anthropogenic climate change and why it's relevant, both in the delivery of veterinary care and, in my case, in the teaching of future veterinarians. And this was really important and resonated strongly with our leadership, and that helped us gain the support that we needed. And from there, the green team was formed, and we were able to voluntarily recruit individuals. Again, I think the voluntary nature of our green team was an asset. In my line of work, we have many committees that you're mandated to be a part of. And we really wanted individuals to be part of this because they were really passionate and wanted to be engaged in looking at the future sustainability efforts. And that didn't limit us in getting necessary sort of a collection of individuals. We had lots of interest and included a diversity of individuals from faculty and staff and students as well, which is really important. And then at our first meeting and subsequent meetings, we really talked about why we were motivated to be there, what we think are the key places we'd like to see initiatives, and continued interacting with leadership on where sort of the goals of the green team and the goals of the leadership can align. And it's been such a rewarding group to be a part of. The energy and passion that all these individuals bring is really helpful, especially when we are talking about climate change and sustainability, which can ultimately be an overwhelming and sort of daunting and grief-ridden space. But having that team and having other individuals that are a part of it just sort of adds that energy and motivation for us to continue on in our efforts. There we go. So now that you know Diccon and I's story, we talk about strengthening your green team. So once you get your green team together, just like any other team, you can't just kind of put everybody together and then forget about, keeping healthy team dynamics. There's some important things that we have learned and others have learned on how to keep that green team strong. So the first is communicating regularly and openly. Ideally, you would have agreed on how you're going to communicate early on. And this can be about updates and also challenges that are happening. It's important to solicit and respond to feedback. So depending on the nature of your group, this feedback could be anonymous or not. Or if you have really created a nice, safe environment, having that feedback together as a group to respond to how the activities are going. Providing resources is another key aspect. Usually this does require buy-in from leadership so that these resources can be provided. And resources aren't necessarily financial. So financial is helpful depending on what your activities are. But if individuals really want to contribute to the team, making sure that there's time allocated to that maybe some scheduling changes can be, that there can be scheduling changes. So, if a team member wants to contribute and there's certain meetings or activities at a certain point, that some of those things can be changed, as well as space to do some of these activities. Collaboration is also necessary. So sometimes when we work in teams, we want to get things done as quickly as possible. So we divide and conquer. But there is inherent value in working together and sort of combining those strengths to really build up that team. Being transparent, especially in the sustainability space, is necessary. So we can think about lots of things that we see where people label things as green and it's not transparent or immediately obvious why it has an impact. And so transparency within your green team and sharing data and knowledge is important. And finally, don't forget to celebrate those wins. regardless of whether they're big or small, taking time to, give your group a pat on the back, and celebrate the things that you have been able to achieve is important, so individuals know that they're recognized, and what they're doing is important and having an impact. And before we move on to the next section, we also wanted to talk about the importance of sustaining your green team and the need for continued buy-in from leadership. So things can happen organically and sort of grassroots, bottom up, but ultimately it kind of needs to be bottom up and top down. And the rationale for this is that ultimately sustainability is for the long run. It's not something that we kind of do and then walk away from. It's something that needs to be ultimately integrated into our organization's values, and it's integrated into what we do every day. And so the more that we can kind of work on getting full practice buy-in, even if it does take some time, is going to be worthwhile in the long run for the long haul of your green team. And also ensure that your green team, that it's sustainable, right? Doing little things, toiling away without any support can be really hard in the long term. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that there's inherent buy-in in eventually getting everybody in your practice on board. This little diagram or image on the side of the screen is to remind me to also talk about the importance when we're getting sustainability buy-in, that the sustainability does not compromise patient care. And it's important that we recognize that, because sometimes there's worry, if we change the way that we're doing things, is that going to compromise patient care? And there's no correlation between your clinic's carbon footprint and your ability to deliver high quality care. And ultimately, when you become more sustainable in your practice, you're not only supporting the care of that individual or continuing to support the care of that individual animal, you're also supporting wider animal, human, and environmental health. Okay, so our next phase is the assess phase, which, if you're a data geek like I am, gathering data on your ecological footprint is an exciting slash sort of overwhelming phase of this. So if you have your green team ready to go, I'm sure with all that passion and energy towards sustainability, you're just ready to jump in. Why not? Everybody has different ideas. They've seen issues around the clinic. You're just ready to jump in. But we really just say stop, which can sometimes be hard to do if you have that energy. But the reason we say stop is it's so important to understand your baseline, to really know where you're starting from and where you need to go. And having this data is going to be invaluable as you move forward and are trying to track your progress over time. So before we get into measuring carbon footprints, let's look at a little bit at greenhouse gases and sort of the science behind this. So if you're not already familiar, there are many different types of greenhouse gases, and these are things that in the atmosphere are going to trap heat, prevent it from escaping the planet, and thus have warming potential. Not all greenhouse gases are created equally, and there are different ones that are released at a different amount and have different warming potentials. So I'm sure everybody has heard of carbon dioxide, which is the most common greenhouse gas. It accounts for about 80% of greenhouse gases and has a warming potential, if we're all going to be relative to one another, at about 1. The other two main greenhouse gases, which are slightly less than carbon dioxide, are methane, which accounts for about 11%, and then nitrous oxide, which accounts for 6 or 7%. Methane has a much greater warming potential at 30 times that of carbon dioxide. And then nitrous oxide has an even higher warming potential. Oh, I skipped ahead too far. And then you'll see a number of other greenhouse gases, which include different types of fluorocarbons that are produced by industries and aerosols and refrigerants. And our anesthetic gases actually fall into this other type. So they are produced in a much smaller amount. But if you look down on the chart on the right-hand side, their warming potential is astronomically larger. And so we can't not think about them, because even if we don't have as much of them, they have a high warming potential. So if we're dealing with all these different greenhouse gases that have different warming potentials and different amounts, it can get a little confusing. And so in much of the literature and the way we measure things, we talk about CO2 equivalents. And so this takes into account the greenhouse gas and its warming potential and equates it at a CO2 equivalent so that we can all kind of be talking in the same language. And then when we get to measuring greenhouse gases and are looking at what we call greenhouse gas accounting, we divide these up into scopes. And essentially, this is the process of determining where our emissions come from. And this helps us to tackle where our emissions are coming from the largest amounts of space, and figuring out how to actually tackle them. And so these scopes are numbered from scopes 1, 2, and 3. And these apply across whatever sort of institution or organization you're working with, and can very easily be applied to veterinary medicine and veterinary clinics. So scope 1 is our direct sources of emissions. So this is if you're burning natural gas for heating, if you have a clinic vehicle and are driving that clinic vehicle and burning gas. It also includes waste anesthetic gases, and then other types of fugitive emissions that come from refrigerants and things like that. In scope 2, these are where fossil fuels are burned somewhere else for something that you're using on site. So generally this is electricity. So electricity, energy is, flipped ahead, consumed somewhere else that then is used to produce that electricity. And it depends on the source of that energy, the emissions associated with it. In some instances, if you use steam, this also falls into scope 2. So steam isn't necessarily really common in smaller places, but for example, at a large institution where I work, the steam is what is actually used for heating and cooling. And so scope 2 is really relevant for us. And then we get to scope 3, which is sort of this large category of all the other emissions that are produced while we do business and do what we do. And so this includes emissions associated with all of the things that we buy, including pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, supplies. To make all those things, there are energy inputs. To get them to us, there are energy inputs. And sometimes these things are a lot harder for us to control, right? We need to purchase something. Somebody else is producing those emissions elsewhere, but they're associated with our business practices. It also includes the elimination of waste. And in many types of medical practice, we do produce a lot of waste. And then business travel, client and staff travel, as well as food and water that we're consuming. And if we look at human healthcare, there's been a lot of efforts to measure this in human healthcare. Scope 1 is about 7 to 21%. So a decent chunk, but not the biggest chunk. Scope 2 is around 11 to 15%. And then scope 3, which is the hardest for us to measure, and includes a lot of different categories, is by far the biggest scope. And so even though it's hard to measure, It's something that we really can't ignore. And if you look at this graph, in the green is all scope 3, you can see the diversity of different places where emissions come from, including purchasing medical equipment, chemicals and gases. And then the biggest source in this in human health care, and this is relevant in veterinary care as well, is the purchase and production of pharmaceuticals. So if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I go about even estimating this for my clinic? There are different pieces of information that you can gather. So for scope 1, you will want to look at your on-site energy bills. So this might be natural gas or oil, depending on how you heat and cool your building. Your anesthetic gas purchases, the distance that you've traveled with any clinic vehicles that might be associated with your practice, as well as the type of that vehicle. And then your topped off fugitive emissions, so different types of refrigerants. Scope 2 includes gathering your electricity bills, and then if you purchase steam, if that's relevant. And then scope 3, there's some helpful data that can help at least give you an estimate of what those emissions are. And so total purchase goods and services and amounts is important. The total amount that you spend on disposing of waste. Business travel, so the distance and the type, and then trying to get an estimate on your total employee commuting and your average total distance client commuting, which will very much differ based on the type of practice that you have and the area which you serve. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Diccon, who's going to talk about a tool that has been developed and is currently being refined to help clinics measure their carbon footprint.
Yeah, great. So because every hospital is going to have different levels of emissions from each scope, it's really important to do an audit, create a baseline or a benchmark of your hospital's carbon impact, and a carbon calculator is an easy tool to use. So this summer, with Veterinary Sustainability Alliance, co-created with the Colorado State University, a US-specific veterinary carbon calculator. And we based it on EPA emissions numbers. Now, so if we go to the next slide. So this is just an example from my hospital in California when we did an audit back in 2023. And I'm just going to point out a few highlights. So on the far left of the screen, you can see in blue, that's stationary combustion. So for us, that's about 3.9%. And that was involving not only our furnace, but also our water heater, which was gas, and actually our tumble dryer, which was also still gas. And recently, we actually transitioned when our hot water heater broke down and wasn't repairable to a heat pump water heater. And so we have managed to decrease that stationary combustion probably somewhere around 5 to 10%. Now, when you're doing this, it would be really lovely to be able to have stratified the amount of gas that we were using for those 3 different main inputs, but we weren't able to do that. But I used some modeling, and so we've come up with that sort of amount based on some looking at how efficient the water heater was, how often it was used, things like that. So then we come to anesthetic gas. And as you can see here, you know, it accounts for about 1.3%. We use isoflurane, not sevoflurane. I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in the next lecture. Anesthetic gas is important, but there are many ways that we can move towards a more efficient way of using anesthesia, and I'll go over that in the next slide, next session. Then we come to electricity. And so for us, we have a huge MRI, a CT, multiple ultrasounds. We've got a very big practice as well. We have more than 80 people in our practice. So this is a big facility. And for us, that was about 14%. Now, when we transition to 100% renewable, zero carbon, or basically net zero carbon electricity, it's mostly geothermal and solar, as we're going to talk about in the next session as well. And we managed to basically reduce it to close to zero. So a dramatic change. Clearly, scope 3 is important, and you can see that here. Now, something that was really surprising, we are just in the suburbs, so we're sort of about an hour and a half outside of San Francisco. We do have some major centers around us, some major towns around us, but that we get a lot of people that might drive 3-4 hours to us from the Central Valley and other places. So employee commuting is pretty significant because many people drive up to half an hour or more every day to our practice, and clients, as we we're just talking about. So when we added, so client commuting is about 16%. Client commuting or travel is about 20%, and client and staff commuting was about 16%. When you add those up, 36%, that's a huge amount. And so something we've been able to put in by talking to our local utility was to put in some EV, or we will be putting in some EV chargers, 9 for staff and client use. And we're hoping that as more people get EVs, that's going to dramatically decrease that, both for our clients and our staff members. We also have a huge e-bike grant. We've got now 4 e-bikes for staff to use, and multiple people that actually don't live as far, and also people go out for lunch and things like that. So we're going to really encourage them to use that. Waste, we've been able to divert. When we made that approximation, it's 6%, and we've managed to divert about 70% of our waste over the last year and a half. So that's really a massive import or decrease as well. And then goods and services, yeah, that's a huge, massive amount at 37%. But by transitioning to reusables and some other things that we've done, including coordinating deliveries, so reducing, consolidating those deliveries, hopefully going to reusable totes and things like that, we've massively been able to reduce some of that over the last 2 years. So, I want to kind of point out how bad it is, but just briefly go over how good you can start to make it in some of the things. And we talk about those next week, but so it doesn't look like you haven't heard what we can do. I just wanted to give those examples. So using those previous gas, electricity, water, waste, and purchasing bills, including those anesthetic gases, when building out your greenhouse inventory, you can then calculate your emissions, and you can then use that information to detail your greatest carbon impacts, prioritize those reduction changes, just like I've been discussing. And actually next week, we're going to host a tutorial for the calculator. It's going to be April 3rd, 9 to 11 Pacific Standard Time. And we can give some more details to participants and attendees at this session after this presentation. Thanks very much, Katie.
Great, thanks, Diccon. And like it said on the previous slide, a priority for us in Canada is to really adapt some of this, because some of the data is built, as Diccon had said, through the EPA, and so adapt it to the Canadian context, so some of the input metrics are helpful there, but that's still under development. And so another part of gathering data is also about reviewing your practice policies. Practices have policies for all sorts of things, from anesthesia to preventative protocols to procurement. And sometimes we just have policies that have been in place for a long time. That's the way we do things, and don't or didn't initially take sustainability into consideration. So by reviewing these policies, which may or may not have to change depending on where you want to devote your efforts, and what your carbon calculator has told you, you can still achieve the same outcomes, but see how you might be able to adapt some of these policies so that you can practice in a more sustainable way. So now we're going to move forward into, sorry, my mouse is very sensitive, into the reflect stage. So you've got your team, you've got your information, and now you're going to review that information and identify priorities to finalize your team goals. So if you will recall, Dr. Duncan introduced the pillars of sustainability in our first call. And essentially, I wanted to bring this up again as we talk about goals, because when we think about setting sustainability goals, they need to be founded on these three pillars. So yes, we want that environmental benefit. That's why we're here and doing what we want. But they also need to take into consideration our social context and the economic context, because our environmental initiatives need to be viable, and they also need to be bearable or likable by the individuals that are doing them, or else we're not going to set ourselves up for success. And so the three pillars of sustainability have been called environmental, social, and economic. There's also people, planet, and profit, the three Ps. So keep those in mind as you're developing your goals. So when we talk about goals, we're going to talk about SMART goals. And maybe you've used these in other goal setting, because it's not specific to sustainability. It's really just about how do we make good goals that are actually going to work for us. So the SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, or achievable. I've seen them interchanged, relevant, and time bound. And we're going to go over how each of those applies in the sustainability space. So specific means you want to provide a detailed description of what you want to achieve. So vague goals are very easy for us to form, but they don't really help us out when we go to implement anything. Measurable means that you're going to assign some sort of quantitative, ideally, or qualitative, depending on what you're setting, but some sort of metric to the outcome so you can measure if you've achieved it or if you're heading in the right direction. Attainable or achievable is really relevant in the sustainability space. So there's many things that go into determining if an action is feasible. So this might mean the team and the resources that you have, the type of practice you have, your employee or client interest, and also the context in which you work. So we have people who are part of Veterinary Sustainability Alliance, and we're from all over North America. And the accessibility to different services that can support sustainability are quite different based on your geographic area. And what's going to work is also dependent on your geographic area. So for example, Diccon just talked about e-bikes. For example, if you live and work in Northern Ontario, where there's 4 feet of snow for half the year, and your clientele, you serve, hundreds of kilometers clientele, maybe those e-bikes aren't really going to work for delivering services. And so that's not something that you want to integrate into your plan initially, because it doesn't really sit well based on your geographic area. But there may be many other things that you can do. And so when you're setting your goals, this is probably the part of a SMART goal setting that will take the most amount of work to see what is available in your area and what can likely work. Next, it's important to assess if your goal is relevant, and this can be based on a variety of different things. So we want to think about the carbon reduction impact, which can be helpful from the information that you achieved from the carbon calculator, the effort for implementation, and also the cost. And you also can integrate other co-benefits as well with different clinic priorities. So maybe there's a high effort and not a huge carbon reduction impact, but it's going to have other wellness benefits within your clinic. And so you want to put your efforts towards that, because there is really important co-benefits. And so here are just some examples. The numbers on the graph are really just to situate, I guess, relativeness. They're not, put into any kind of calculator to measure. But on the ease of effort, we have installing LED lights. It has some carbon reduction impact. It's not a huge cost. It can be one of those early easy wins. And once a little bit of effort has been put in to change them, everybody just still turns on the lights as usual. Versus in the top right corner, big sort of infrastructure changes like replacing your insulation if needed, installing triple glazed windows for increased energy efficiency, installing solar panels. Those might take a lot of effort. There might be some disruptions in your clinic if, you know, they're changing out windows depending on when they can do it. And they usually have a high cost associated with them. So that might not be the place you're necessarily going to start, but it can have a big carbon reduction impact. And so you can proceed to that in the future. And then finally, the goals need to be time bound. So you want to outline when the action needs to be in place. If you're anything like me, if people send me something to do and they don't give me a deadline, it sits on my to-do list for a very long time. Not because I don't care about it, but because I need that deadline. And so this is important as part of your goals as well. So I've included some examples of what I've called vague goals and SMART goals. So someone might say, we really want to reduce waste in the practice. Very admirable goal, but it doesn't help you figure out how you're going to get there and what that actually looks like. So you might have a series of SMART goals that accompany this to help you provide direction. So maybe begin composting of all organic waste by May 2025, and it has those SMART elements in there. Buy Energy Star appliances. So, well, when are you going to do that? And what appliances are you going to buy? So a SMART goal might be when our vaccine fridge needs to be replaced. We don't want to just go out and buy all new appliances, but when it needs to be replaced, we'll put in a plan in place to buy a top-rated Energy Star model. And then I'm sure many people want to buy less single-use items. Again, that goal doesn't provide us with much direction. So we can revise that to replace disposable surgical gowns with reusable washable gowns for all surgeries by December 2025. And that type of goal is going to help you lay the foundation for your plan. So as Diccon had mentioned, and you're probably wondering, well, Katie, where are you getting all these ideas for goals from? You haven't given us any of that information. And CORE, that's at that foundation, works in tandem with clinic and community, which are our next two sessions. And so as Diccon had sort of laid a few little tasters, clinic is going to have a ton of ideas and activities that can help you build those goals and know what sustainability looks like in your clinic. So just so that you're not wondering how all of these pieces fit together. So finally, we come to developing a plan. So this is about setting up your implementation strategy and having milestones and deliverables. So we can take a lot from project management on how to create a good plan. The first is about identifying all associated tasks. Sometimes this is called like a work breakdown structures where you just essentially list everything that needs to be done. Then you establish a sequence of tasks. So some things can happen concurrently. Some have to happen in advance of the others. You map out your timeline based on what you've had for your goal, assign roles and responsibilities, and then elicit feedback. And actually feedback should kind of be happening throughout this whole thing so you can learn about what's working for your team, what's not, and how to move forward. So as you're creating this plan, there's been some literature and studies on how do we actually know and can facilitate successful environmental change within a workplace. And this publication by Young et al. Was a review. It looked at lots of different studies, and they outlined that the strongest predictors of successful environmental change in a workplace include environmental awareness. So that's really about, you know, like Diccon and I did when we set up our green team, why do we really care about this? Performance feedback, so making sure people, you know, sometimes if it's a new activity, they're not sure if they're doing it right. So giving them feedback to help build that confidence. Financial incentives if necessary, making sure that there's supportive infrastructure to help these things happen. That again, there's that management support. And finally, that staff get the training they need so that they can implement those changes. So let's walk through an example to see what this might look like in practice. And so I've chosen this SMART goal. So initiate nitrile glove recycling for all non-hazardous, non-contaminated glove uses by August 2025. So I chose this example. It might be something that might be new to your practice. It's not so hard that we can't go through it in about 5 minutes, but might give you some ideas about what some of these projects might look like. And so for this example, our first step is identifying all associated tasks. And you might kind of start off with big buckets of tasks. So, okay, if we're going to do recycling, we want to get containers. We might want to pilot the initiative to see how it works and, what kind of issues we run into. We want to make sure staff are educated. Then we'll launch our program. And ideally, we want to get to the end where we can celebrate success and continue to build on it. But these buckets need to be divided out further so we really know what it looks like. And so this might be about finding companies that can help you with the recycling, talking to other clinics in your area if they have experience with this, figuring out what the rules and restrictions are to the types of recycling, and then ultimately choosing the recycling company you're going to work with. For piloting, you want to choose the area you're going to determine where your pilot is. So maybe it's the treatment area. You want to establish your time frame and your success indicators, do your pilot, make sure that there's time for feedback, and then make those necessary changes. For staff education, this might be a lunch and learn, maybe something simpler than that, posting signage, and considering incentives if that's really going to work for your team. Then you launch your program, you're going to measure your success, respond to feedback, and make sure that there's check-in times so that feedback does get incorporated. And then for celebrating success, this might be maybe something you want to talk to your clients about. So you have that business case, communicate with your staff so that they really know that what they've done has made a positive difference, and then communicate with leadership to continue to get that buy-in. Now, I didn't put all of these Post-it notes together to make this seem overwhelming. Really, with just a little bit of brainstorming and thought, it took me about 5 minutes to think this out. But the rationale is to just think about all of the things that need to be in place so that, again, you set yourself up for success. Then we want to establish the sequence of activities. And as you can see, some happen one before another. So you have to find your companies before you choose it. Yes, that's quite obvious. But some things can happen concurrently. So discussions and feedback. But this will help you knowing the sequence of tasks so that you can determine if individuals can be working on things at the same time and sort of everybody building momentum, and then what needs to happen in front of one another. And so certainly you want to make sure that your training is positioned at the right time so that then when you employ your initiative, that staff are empowered to make those changes with the information they have. And then you can map out that timeline. So if you recall, I had set my goal to be by the end of August 2025. And then I kind of worked backwards thinking about building in time so that it wasn't rushed, that there's opportunities for feedback, while still sort of gaining momentum and allowing us to see success happen. And the other thing that I want to leave you with today is that this is an iterative process. And so we don't expect you to, form your team, have your baseline assessments, and then have an entire plan on how to get to net zero by 2040, which is, a common goal established by the UN. That's a really overwhelming task, and it doesn't necessarily set yourself up for success to build momentum and build team buy-in and see what works and what doesn't work. And so essentially, once you're empowered with your data, choose a few goals you can work with. Set those targets, complete your activity, gather feedback, see what works, set a new goal, and continue on this iterative process. And that's a really great way to build your team up, see success, but also not tackle things that are really hard right at the beginning that maybe you haven't set the groundwork for those things to happen. And this is, a long-term process. Change takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And so this is to make sure that you don't go in already feeling discouraged, that it is this ongoing iterative team-based process. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Diccon just for a few final words about the business case for sustainability and building that in as you think about setting the stage for your green team and your plan.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Yeah, that's a brilliant example. So yeah, finally, we're going to take a look at the business case for sustainability. And as Dr. Colleen Duncan in the last presentation referred to in her great article, the survey done of clients' attitude to sustainable practices, it's a really good insight into that business case for sustainability. So when you look on the left figure 4, they looked at these questions, and 62% of clients would like to be informed about the sustainability efforts made by their veterinary clinic. 63% would be interested to know the environmental impact of veterinary care. And even for the most business-oriented of us, 61% of clients would consider sustainability efforts of businesses when deciding where to spend their money on goods and services. Next slide. And furthermore, as she showed that 52% or so of clients are willing to pay up to 10% or more for sustainable business practices, maybe 12% even up to 15%, and 7% even up to 20%. And the impact of corporate sustainability on employees and customers really shouldn't be underestimated. And according to this 2016 Harvard Business Review, companies that demonstrate strong sustainability principles and actions have improved employee morale of about 55%, 30% improved employee loyalty and retention, and about 16% improved productivity. And I think any of us in veterinary medicine at this time would celebrate and embrace those kind of numbers. And they also showed that you could have improved customer loyalty and repurchasing, with customers being willing to pay up to 20% in premium based on positive corporate responsibility performance. And as I'm going to discuss in detail next week, many environmental reduction interventions are going to save you money in the long run. And that includes energy efficiency, using cheaper renewable electricity sources. They will be cheaper long-term for sure. Electrical appliances and machines such as heat pumps that do not create those on-site emissions and pollution, and also can provide safer working environments. And I have quite a few examples of those next time. So there's really a great business case for sustainability. And it's really very important we understand it's one of the 3 pillars of sustainability: that profit, as well as people and planet, and ensuring that management or owners of practices understand that sustainability can be profitable in many ways is absolutely essential for enabling our transition. And I'm going to hand it back to Katie.
Great, thanks, Diccon. So that brings us to the end of our core section. And that covered convene, assess, reflect, and plan. And as Diccon had mentioned, next webinar, which is at the end of mid-April, sorry, clearly forgetting what month it is the clinic session. So about implementing behavioral and physical change to meet your sustainability goals. And this covers energy, waste, water, procurement, and transportation. And so with that, I see we're at the end of our time today. And so we can stay on for a few questions. I see that there is one in the chat about considering the effects of reusing supplies. For example, when you wash and re-autoclave surgical gloves, it takes time and water and soap and autoclave time and electricity. So I think that this brings up an interesting concept about, yes, it is exceptionally important for us to look at what we would call a life cycle or life chain analysis, where you look at the entire life cycle for a product. But studies have consistently shown, so a huge amount of energy and natural resources and transportation has to go into making of supplies. Versus we have very energy efficient appliances now for washing and reusing things that reusing things, and this doesn't even take into account the emissions associated with waste and disposing of those wastes, that reusable have market environmental benefits. And so although they're, you know, if we think many, many years ago, we used to have highly energy inefficient appliances and things that used a ton of water. That's no longer the case. And so reusing supplies, although, you know, it's important to look at individual supplies, and we are a very science-based organization and always looking at the literature, that the argument for reusing is very, very strong. I see some thank yous, and thank you for joining us. If there's other questions, we're happy to answer them as well, or you can bring them to the next webinar too.
Katie, if I could also just remind everyone, so that webinar number 3, Pathways to a Sustainable Clinic, so that part 2 clinic, that's going to be hosted here. So April 24th, at the same time, 9:30, that's that Thursday. So I really look forward to seeing you all then. I'll be talking extensively about life cycle analyses as well, procurement and the entire value chain, and we'll discuss waste and the impacts of waste on our health, as well as the environmental health. So a lot of those questions, or a lot of those points that Katie was just referring to, we will also be detailing discussions on that next time.
All right, well, thank you everyone, and we will see you at our next session, hopefully.